The marchers have continued to press forward with their plans to bring the Jotun thralls living in Mornwald into their nation. At the summer equinox, Lily Guildenstern made the breadbasket available to the folk of the marches with the express intent that it be used to encourage both peoples to come together to celebrate the autumn wassail. Their actions were endorsed by an important statement passed in the assembly, urging people to share what they have. If backed with a mandate, it would be effective in helping to bridge the gap between thralls and those marchers who still see them as the enemy. At least it'd help with those marchers who are prepared to consider the idea. There's one group of folk living in the Mornwald who are not remotely prepared to countenance celebrating the wassail with the hated Jotun. The village of Whittle in the Mornwald has played a role in recent events that is out of all proportion to its size. The inhabitants resisted the conquest of the Jotun for 30 years, driven by their hatred of the invaders. Their priest was condemned by the Imperial Synod for his faith and executed, but still the Whittle folk refused to abandon their beliefs. Perhaps it's something about hatred itself. The more Synod priests tried to persuade them to put aside their beliefs, the more fiercely they clung to them. Eventually, the settlement was overrun by the advancing Jotun armies, and the Whittle folk were finally forced to admit defeat. Beaten, but not broken, those that survived fled to Tasato, while the remainder fought alongside the Imperial armies. When the Morn was liberated, the majority of the Whittle folk soon returned to their homes to resume their old lives and their old practices. They were always careful not to be seen openly preaching hatred, but it's clear to anyone who spends a few hours in their company that their view of orcs and of the Jotun have not softened one iota. As the Empire wrestled with the problem of what to do with the large population of Jotun former thralls living in Mornwald, Whittle became the focus for those who shared their view that the orcs must be driven off or killed. When the prognosticator's office was asked to assess what could be done to assimilate the former thralls, their analysis was uncompromising. If the marchers accepted the Jotun thralls into the nation without first dealing with the Whittle, then violence would surely follow. There were a few good ideas on how to deal with them. Even though the area is known to be a hotbed of hatred, the law as it stands at present only allows the Imperial Synod to condemn people by name. People cannot be tried and executed simply on suspicion of being hateful. The obvious first step was for the Marchers' Synod to speak plainly on the matter with an appropriate mandate. With few other palatable alternatives, that process was begun at the summer solstice. All that remains now is to decide on how best to finish the matter. The autumn wassail. The wassail is a traditional Marcher festival to celebrate the collection of harvest at the end of summer. Wassailing varies from place to place, but typically involves parading through the village, singing and drinking to the health of the fields and the orchards. Food and drink produced during the year are consumed or left as an offering. It is a time for community to come together and share what they have. As folk go from house to house, they share food and drink with their community and receive in return a taste of the food that each household has in excess from their own harvests. Even the situation in Braggisland doesn't dampen the spirits of the Marcher people. For some, celebrating the harvest in the face of the Jotun conquest demonstrates their defiance of the Jotun invaders. Indeed, it is the spirit of wassail engendered by Lily's statement that's gone some way towards creating the circumstances that would bring the people of the Marches, orc and human alike, together to fight the invaders in the event that the military council chooses to fight at Bil Sabi. The Jotun thralls also celebrate the autumn harvest, although they do so in a very different way. Each household keeps a shrine to the ancestors, either a single favoured ancestor, or else one that celebrates all the Fadir in the Jotun pantheon. Members of the household leave offerings at the shrine through the equinox, hoping to attract the blessings and the protection of the ancestors for them and their household. In some ways, it is little different to Marcher traditions of harvest offerings. Ale used to toast a barley field or a pat of butter buried in a dairy pasture. Yet, more common ground between these two peoples. To ensure the effective use of the breadbasket, the Marcher Assembly could endorse the following mandate. The breadbasket reflects the bounty of the Marchers, the fruits of our hard work. We send this priest with 25 doses of liao to urge every Marcher to share this bounty with all their neighbours. Let us invite the thralls of Mornwald to feast together with us, so none is left a stranger. If this mandate is passed, then the Marcher households across the Mornwald, and perhaps more importantly beyond, will share the largesse of the breadbasket with their neighbours. It will help forge closer ties between the market town and households, as well as with the thralls of the Mornwald. Invitations will be issued to the orcs to visit Upwold, Midwold and beleaguered Bregasland as guests for the Harvest Festival. There may be problems. Some people will be meeting the thralls for the first time, and that will bring difficulties. But these difficulties are unavoidable if the marchers are really committed to going down this line. The open mandate that would allow the Marcher Egregore to bond the Mournward thralls will remain an option, but the amount of Liao to complete it will be reduced by 25 doses. Sadly, the appeal of the priests will fall on deaf ears in some parts of the Mournworld. The Whittle folk will not be inviting orcs to share the repast. The last die. The Marcher Assembly passed a statement of principle that offered the Whittle folk one last chance to recant their heretical views. It's a vain hope. The Whittle folk have repeatedly refused to denounce hatred. They're clear that it's the only enduring power of their faith that gave them the strength to resist the Jotun for so long. Why should they abandon their faith now, simply because it's inconvenient for the Synod? But it's clear to everyone that the Marcher Assembly is acting with heavy heart. Nobody wishes to see the Whittle folk pay the ultimate price. But if that's a sacrifice needed to resolve the matter of the Jotun thralls, then so be it. The response is as predictable as it is unfortunate. Mel of the Morn receives a note from the Whittle folk that says simply this: "Our faith is a sword to defend everything we hold dear. It was sharp enough to see off the Jotun, reckon it will be sharp enough to see off the Synod too. What's needed in the Morn is a drop more courage. It's that as teaches folk to cleave to the truth through thick and thin. There's enough courage in Whittle that will not give up the virtues for you. If our neighbours over the border had a dram more courage, then they wouldn't be changing our ways to take in the Jotun. But they're too frit to see this war through to the end, so they're full of talk for taking in Jotun as if the orcs had been raised in the same village all of a sudden. We'll have none of that round here. We remember what it means to be Marcher, and we take pride in that, even if everyone has forgotten. Sally Thatcher, Whittle." On the surface, the inescapable reality appears to be that nothing's going to persuade the Whittle folk to abandon their faith. Nothing. They cling to their faith as strongly as the most devout highborn initiate. It defines them, and they will not give it up. Not for the Empire, not for the Marcher Assembly, not for anyone. In practice, most priests who have spoken with the Whittle folk believe that there are probably little more than a score of ringleaders that keep that community together. Without their leadership, Whittle would probably collapse. Some of those who were left behind, those less committed to their ideals, would take up an offer to rejoin their brethren in Tasato if one were forthcoming. The problem of Whittle could be dealt with, provided that the Synod can lay hands on the people in charge and try them for their crimes. That will not be easy, but there are two clear options. The Ineluctable Law. It's not possible for the militia to arrest any citizen for religious crimes unless they have first been condemned by the Imperial Synod. But the Imperial Senate could pass a Senate motion instructing the magistrates to carry out a thorough investigation of Whittle with a view to identifying and naming any resident who they identify as a follower of hatred. That would take a season to carry out, and clearly the folk in the Whittle would be aware of it happening. At the next summit, the magistrate would present the Synod with a list of suspects that they had identified, and then the Synod could then pass judgment on them. The magistrates could then send the militia to arrest anyone condemned by the Synod. They would be tried, and those found guilty would be executed. This isn't a fast process, and it has the obvious disadvantage that the Whittle folk would be completely aware of what was taking place. They might choose to flee, or they might attempt to put up a fight. In the view of those who've dealt with them, the latter option seems more likely, and certainly more likely than the idea that they will cooperate. But once complete, the Empire would be done with the matter. Whittle would probably be abandoned, and there would still be some lingering remnants of hatred in the Mournwold, but any public resistance to the integration of the Jotun thralls or opposition to the Marcher Synod would be gone. This method would identify and potentially eliminate all the most public, most committed devotees of hatred in Whittle. Vigilance thwarts malice. The Vigilance Assembly have made clear that if the Marcher Assembly will not take necessary steps to deal with Whittle, then they will. At the recent summit, they passed a judgment stating that if the Marchers did not deal with the blight in their field, then the Vigilance Assembly would do it for them. This is no empty threat. The Silent Bell is a small but deeply committed sodality dedicated to gathering information about internal threats to the Empire. They operate a loose but extensive network of informants throughout the vigilant sects in the Empire. By drawing on that network, they can potentially track down information about specific threats. Mornwalders who are members of the Silent Bell, and there are more than a few, could be tasked to spy on their neighbours in Whittle and try to discover who amongst them was the most influential. However, the Silent Bell could be even more effective if they were tasked to work with the Grey Pilgrims by walking the Mornwald trods. By using the Grey Pilgrims as their eyes and ears, the Silent Bell could attempt to hunt down any hateful figures currently active in the territory. To do this, the Assembly of Nine would need to pass an appropriate mandate. The suggested mandate is as follows. The practice of hatred in the Mornwald cannot be tolerated any longer. We send this priest with 25 doses of Liao to lead the Silent Bell in tracking down those whose heart has turned to hate with the aid of the Grey Pilgrims. Like using this law, it's not a fast process, but it would have the clear advantage that the Whittle folk wouldn't be aware of what was happening unless someone tipped them off with a winged messenger. The Synod would be able to identify the heretics involved and pass judgment without the Whittle folk being aware of what was taking place. The Silent Bell do not have any legal powers to arrest lawbreakers, but like the militia, they could provide the Imperial Synod with a list of those responsible. If the Synod chose to condemn those named, then the militia could then deal with them the following season. Again, this would deal with the matter of Whittle once and for all, but it would also potentially root out any vestiges of hate in the Mornwald. This method would attempt to identify and potentially eliminate all the most influential and important devotees of hatred in the territory. The Fateful Step. The third option is to force the Whittle folk to play their hand and reveal themselves. The Empire could just press ahead with their plans to bring the thralls into the Empire and ignore the opposition of Whittle and those who share their hatred of the Jotun. If that happens, then Whittle will rise up in armed opposition, but that will render issues of the law moot, and then the Imperial armies can be sent in to deal with them. This would be a much faster process, and provided the army orders are clear, then everyone involved would be captured or dead. While this seems a somewhat brutal option, it may come to putting down an insurrection with the army anyway if the Empire are not careful. This approach at least has the advantage that it will be the decision of the Whittle folk to take the fateful step and not the Empire. The Tasato option. Some of the Whittle folk never left Tasato after the Jotun were driven from their lands. They continue to live in Little Mornwald, an enclave of marchers in the heart of Mestra. Merchant Prince Mariana of the Wild River Crossing Guild has proposed that the problem in the Mornwald could be solved by offering the Whittle folk sanctuary in Tasato, far away from the former thralls, at least for the immediate future. Her proposal is being discussed by the bishops of the League, and it'll be up to them how to proceed. Many marchers fear that whilst the Tasato option may offer some resolution to the immediate problem, it does nothing to address the wider issue of the Whittle folk's acceptance of the malign spiritual power of hatred. A place to fight. The former thralls do not fight. This is what makes them thralls in Jotun society. But some of their children are not interested in a life of back-breaking toil in the farms and the mines of the Mornwald. They hear the roar of their ancestors in their blood and wish to seize their one chance to cross the howling abyss. During the summer solstice, the Imperial Orc Assembly sent Bloodcrow Udu and a handful of preachers to the Mornwald to speak to the thralls, to those youths considering their options, and to the marchers who know the former thralls best. In the process, they made it clear that any young orc who wished to fight and win the favour of their ancestors could do so among the Imperial orcs. The immediate effects of this are likely to be minimal. There are not that many young orcs coming of age in the Mornwald who wish to fight. Those who do will become Imperial orcs. There are no restrictions about the former thralls joining the nation. They will not hear the voices of the Imperial orc ancestors, of course. They will hear their own Jotun ancestors. But as they grow up and start families, their descendants will hear both the Imperial orc and the Jotun ancestors.